What is consciousness? Is it unique to humans, like is a bat or a tree or an AI agent conscious? What does it mean for something to be subconscious or unconscious? What does altering consciousness with psychedelic compounds teach us about its nature? How does understanding consciousness help us improve our mental health? In today's episode of the Psychedelic Therapy Frontiers podcast, we discuss these questions and more as we explore the nature of conscious awareness. For those of you who are new to the show, welcome. Psychedelic Therapy Frontiers is brought to you by Numinous Network and is hosted by me, Dr. Steve Thayer, and my co-host, Dr. Reid Robison. Just a few announcements for you before we get into the episode. If you're looking for comprehensive foundational training in psychedelic-assisted therapy that includes live online classes, experiential learning, and opportunities to connect with a diverse community of practitioners in the psychedelic medicine space, then check out our courses. We're currently offering 10% off select courses for PTF podcast listeners, so click on the link in the show notes or go directly to numinous.com/training, and you can use the code PTF10 for that 10% discount. If you've listened to the show for a while, you've likely heard Reid and I talk about the psychedelic clinical trial work that Numinous Network does. If you or someone you know is interested in being a participant in a psychedelic clinical trial, you can click on the link in the show notes or go directly to numinous.com/research to learn more about the trials we're currently running. If you enjoy the show and you'd like to support the show, you can do so by leaving a rating or review in places like Apple Podcasts or Spotify. If you're watching on YouTube, you can like the video, subscribe to the channel, and of course, share the episode with someone else who might be interested in the nature of consciousness. Without further delay, here's today's episode on consciousness. So, Reid, this is one of these episodes that's probably going to get real weird real fast. We picked a fun topic for today that it will likely result in lots of interesting tangents. Interesting, hopefully, to the listeners, but at least interesting to us.
We shall see.
We shall see. We're going to talk a little bit.
What is it?
We're going to. I'm revealing it live to Reid right now, and he's going to improvise. We're going to talk about consciousness today.
No.
Yeah.
Anything but consciousness.
Anything but
It
consciousness.
is one of my favorite topics, I'd say.
Yeah, and when we have complicated topics like this, we often like to start with some kind of definition. And how might you define consciousness, Reid?
How couldn't you define it? it's
everything and nothing.
Let's try on a few.
Yeah.
So exactly, consciousness is everything we know, everything we experience. That's one weird way to describe it. Here's another semi-weird way. Consciousness is awareness, felt experience, and sentience, perhaps. But we could get, and probably should get scientific about it too, but how do you like to describe it?
Yeah, so the subjective experience of awareness is one way to think about it.
Yeah.
There's a lot of different elements to consciousness. There's sort of volition. There's a sense of selfhood. There's this, it does involve wakefulness or arousal. Hard to say that one is conscious if one isn't experiencing. But then this is where it can get real weird. Like what do we mean by experiencing? Because I can probably experience a lot of things and have no memory of them, like a dream. Does that mean I wasn't conscious during that time because I have no memory of it? Like,
yeah,
this is where it gets a little fragmented.
I love the landmines, potholes, and rabbit holes that we'll encounter while even just trying to describe consciousness. But I think that's a great starting place. Like if consciousness is the totality of sensory experience, let's say, and then where does it come from? So what is it? And because there are two schools of thought here, I guess there are infinite debates about consciousness, but one kind of foundational question, I think, is this question of, is consciousness something that comes out of complex processing in our brains, or is it a more basic phenomenon, like an all-pervading force in nature? Or to put it another way, is why is our universe that is apparently like teeming with this non-conscious matter, if we describe it as only brain stuff, how did these molecules that we're made of configure in such a way to have a felt experience?
Right. Yeah, I'll say it again, sort of in my own words, because is consciousness something that emerges when matter is organized in a particular way? So when matter is organized in the human form, is it something that sort of emerges out of that particular organization of matter, of molecules and electrical signals and chemical processes and things? Or like you said, is it something that is fundamental to the universe, not unlike time or gravity? And that it experiences itself when it is organized in a particular way that is the human brain. And is it only the human brain, right? We can get into sort of the really interesting and potentially controversial subject of, could artificial intelligence be conscious? Because that's just arranging matter in a different kind of way, not exactly like a human brain, but is it exclusive to human brains?
Yeah.
It's weird.
It does get weird. So I'm scared to even go towards the robot consciousness part. But let's start with
we can bookmark it.
Furry, cute little bats, because there was this like famous essay. Who was it? Thomas Nagel, who wrote an essay in the 70s that said it's called "What Is It Like to Be a Bat?" And it's this question of it touches on philosophy. Neuroscience and animal cognition even, but do bats have consciousness is kind of the question. Because these are these creatures that echolocate the world and navigate things. So, well, what would you say? Would you call that a type of consciousness?
I think so. I mean, of course, depends on how we define it, and that's what we're talking about. But, we can certainly measure the electrical activity of a bat's brain, and it is responding to things in its environment using echolocation. It has a drive to eat
My
and
car does
procreate. That. Yeah, your self-driving car does that. So is your your Tesla conscious?
So the neuroscientists and philosophers and biologists that debate these things, like traditionally have used certain tests of like self-awareness. Can a bat recognize itself in a mirror? And when they test that, the answer is no. How about perception and decision making? Yeah, but robots, vehicles can do that too. And interestingly, like we're talking about Tesla's, Elon has said, like I heard him describe it in an interesting way, weird way, but he's a weird dude, right? That he's trying to create this autonomous creature that can navigate the world and get you places, right?
Yeah, and that autonomous creature senses things, right? It has sensors. It takes in data from the environment and responds to that data.
Yeah, so like a bat is using echolocation to navigate and hunt, respond to their environment. How about social interactions? Like, I think the self-awareness of those like checkpoints is probably the most important one, but I think my takeaway is more that instead of seeing consciousness as an all or nothing, like perhaps it exists on a spectrum, and bats have a bat-like reality that's quite different with echolocation and instinct. And we don't know their subjective experience.
Well, that was going to be my point. Like, we don't know that they are not self-aware. Like we have to infer based on some test of like showing a bat its reflection.
They don't like mirrors, okay?
But and then we have to infer that means that they're not self-aware, but we don't know. Like one of the reasons we know or have guesses at each other's self-awareness is that we have language, a shared language to communicate about awareness. But for all I know, I'm a brain in a vat in some matrix-like computer, and everyone else is an NPC, and I'm the only conscious being.
Is that what you believe?
I don't. Sometimes, if I'm high enough, I might believe such things.
Ayahuasca will do crazy things to you. Yeah. Speaking of which,
DMT is a hell of a drug.
We may and we intend to meander to what psychedelics might teach us about consciousness, and what they do to your experience of consciousness, perhaps a little bit. But I think consciousness does seem more like a process than a static thing, right? Or like an impermanent, ever-changing flow of, it's like this real-time passing of sensory events, perhaps. But what do you think of like this whole idea of training awareness. Like, is consciousness a trainable skill, to put it in a weird way?
Yeah, I mean, we first sort of stumble into different ways to use the word consciousness. Like, I can be conscious of a thing if I pay attention to it. We've talked a lot about mindfulness, and using mindfulness to train one's awareness to pay attention to specific things. And so I could be unconscious of sounds in the environment. My eardrum is probably picking up on those sounds, but I'm not consciously aware of them until something draws my attention to them, a very loud sound, or I decide, I'm really going to take a breath, close my eyes, and pay attention to auditory signals. And all of a sudden,
catch more of that, perhaps, more of that passing stuff.
But to your question, I can train my attention and my consciousness to be more sensitive to those particular stimuli, right?
Yeah.
If I have been told I'm chronically disconnected from my body, I might just try to train my awareness, my consciousness, so that I'm more conscious.
Remember, you have a body.
Of bodily sensations.
Yeah, and emotions. Like, we do this a lot in our profession, right? Is there's this thing that can happen and happens on, I believe, a small degree to everyone, of like, disconnecting from emotions, and perhaps for all sorts of reasons, through, the stresses and challenges of day-to-day life, but then and in depression, for example, alexithymia, like inability to feel certain emotions, and the journey to reconnecting to those, and not only gives you all this information about how to navigate the world and experience of joy, also sadness.
Right.
But it just, that's one of the domains of consciousness, perhaps, that you can train some skills into experience more of.
Right. Yeah. And so this is making me think of what's pretty central to our profession, and that is these ideas of levels of consciousness. The conscious mind, subconscious, preconscious, the unconscious mind, and what can live in the unconscious mind. Yeah. So you talk about training one's attention to things that maybe we aren't consciously aware of. Makes me think of trauma, right? And the way we sometimes think about people who struggle with post-traumatic stress disorder is that there are these things that have happened to them that are too painful to consciously process, that then are suppressed or repressed into unconscious, territories of our mind. And they don't disappear. They're still there. And people will talk about it living in your central nervous system as a pattern, or living in your memory or your body. Are we not conscious of those things? What does it mean to have unconscious processes operating behind the veil?
Yeah. And the unconscious, it can be a bit of a trap, I think, because we're talking about consciousness as both like the sensory experience that you might be more aware of, but also we have 80,000 plus thoughts a day, and we're not catching and all the input that comes in, an infinite amount perhaps throughout the day, we're not attending to that with our conscious attention. But it seems to me that's still a part of the flow of consciousness, and PTSD as an example of when people do kind of wall off a trauma because it was from even parts of it from their memory, because it was too overwhelming for the system. I think that represents a wisdom inherent in our consciousness that can do that for a time. And of course, there's still work to return to, integrate into our more whole self again after that occurs.
Yeah. So it puts pressure on this definition of consciousness, right? Even calling it the unconscious mind, because it's something that the mind, the brain, the nervous system is still registering somehow, but we don't have sort of an articulable consciousness about that particular thing. We can't put language to it or report on it necessarily.
Yeah. Because if you go into a hospital and you ask for like a clinical consciousness assessment, you're going to get, probably the neurology team coming along to do a Glasgow coma scale, right? Or you might be evaluating someone with locked-in syndrome after brain damage by looking at eye blinking for signs of that. Or maybe you're looking at an functional MRI after a severe physical trauma in a
Seizure
coma,
or something, yeah.
and to see if there's blood flow, or EEG used in similar ways to look for brain activity. I think we've kind of teased the fact that defining consciousness is tricky for us humans, operating in with these mystery brains, with this mysterious force that we're trying to talk about.
Yeah, some people talk about it in terms of the easy problem of consciousness versus the hard problem of consciousness. Like the easy problem being, it's easy to say that consciousness is reducible to these measurable things that you're talking about with like the visit to the hospital. But it's hard to explain why these measurable things give rise to a sense of consciousness, a sense of selfhood.
Yeah.
You know, this sense that there's an I somewhere in there, and that I is perceiving all these things. And that I is me. It's a sense of self.
Yeah.
You know, we've talked about different like meditation strategies to sort of get at this, what one might call the non-dual idea of consciousness. That, and it's like sometimes called the headless way, or when you're meditating to try to look at the looker, like turn consciousness on itself to realize that everything is just emerging. It doesn't come from a place.
Yeah.
Trippy.
So it is trippy. And one of my kind of favorite meditation teachers, Shinzen Young, describes the different types of consciousness, or I like to call them channels, if you will. But there's our ordinary consciousness, and we talk about like ordinary waking consciousness a lot, or everyday kind of waking reality. But then there's expanded consciousness. He talks about states of like more clarity, spaciousness, maybe unity. But then the third one he'll talk about is a dissolved consciousness, like that true new non-duality, or maybe that mega dose of psychedelics, right? Where your sense of self disappears. And they have words for this in like Buddhist and Hindu kind of yoga and meditation practices, like nirodha, or like cessation or emptiness. Yeah.
So emptiness being like you are just pure awareness.
It's like, what when I went to a far off land once upon a time to experience 5-MeO DMT, like it felt like that medicine for me, and there are infinite varieties of this experience, of course, felt like more of a cessation of consciousness than a fireworks. It was more like, poof, you're deleted from the universe. You're a pixel floating in a sea of like never-ending emptiness. But it's really hard to really answer if you were still an I, a sense of self, or at what point, because you do re-enter your body, you come back, and it's
well, and you
fast.
have memory of this. So what is it that has a memory of the nothingness?
I didn't really get deleted.
Something was there. Something was there enough to experience it to be able to report on it, right?
Yeah. So, yeah, that. But I do like that kind of spectrum of consciousness.
Yeah.
And I think there are sub-channels of this all along the way, but from ordinary consciousness to expanded states to like complete ego dissolution, or dissolved consciousness, dissolved into non-duality.
Yeah. It makes me think of like how much of consciousness is perceiving the quote unquote real world, and how much of it is a projection onto the real world. I like this idea of channels. It makes me think, was it Huxley that talked about the mind as a reducing valve of sort of this, something that the brain couldn't possibly be consciously aware of all the data coming at it. And so one of the major, and we talked about this a bit last time when we talked about heuristics, right? In the stories we tell ourselves, but its job is to sort of cut out stuff and reduce our attention to the things that we can immediately perceive and cogitate on. Like
my vehicle does, right? When it's only seeing 10 cars ahead and not worrying about what's a mile away.
Yeah.
So, all right. So that's kind of where we've meandered to, is this idea that, whatever we're calling it, we can train our skills in this consciousness to experience more of life, right? To hone our sensory clarity, if you will, tune into our different senses, to train our attention, to even harness more equanimity, to be able to hold more consciousness flowing through you at once, perhaps, through these kind of mindfulness practices, systems of practice, if you will, and other ways of ending up there in life. Lots of non-ordinary states get you there.
Right.
Or non-ordinary practices get you there.
To the non-ordinary states. Yeah. And to some extent, your pleasure or displeasure with your life, it can be reduced to what you are conscious of, like what you're paying attention to.
What you attend to. Attention again. We've been talking about this. I think randomly yesterday I showed you a t-shirt, I think that, what was that? It was an abstract from a paper that said, "Attention is all you need." And it's an old paper by Vaswani, if anyone wants to look at it. But it's not about what you think. It's highly technical, I think, linguistics paper. But attention, we've said on here, is the currency of love, is an interesting kind of koan to sit with. But there is a lot to be said about attention, aka presence, and what it does to your experience of life.
Right. So my mind, my consciousness, keeps getting tugged in the direction of psychedelics, partly because I mentioned that reducing valve, and you talked about channels. Yeah. And it's so fascinating to wonder about what consciousness is through the lens of the ways consciousness is altered by psychedelics, by these things that we ingest or inject or whatever they are, right? Substances that alter the way our brain and central nervous system functions, the way our brain interacts with itself, and the way it sort of perceives the world. And it's not just psychedelics, right? There's other ways to alter consciousness, just flow states, breathing, cold water exposure, eating.
And I would argue that in addition to being able to change your state of consciousness, your subjective experience of that state of consciousness, perhaps in the moment, like your consciousness is also, or expression of it is ever changing. But I'm thinking of, like, you could think about channels of consciousness that we all dwell in day to day, where you as a psychologist see the world more on the psychological channel than the
engineer,
astrologer, who's like, you're seeing people and, microprocessing and formulating these semi-conscious judgments or assessments of people, and someone else might be looking and say, oh, that person's a Libra,
That's funny. Libra was the first thing that came to my mind too. We got some panpsychism going here.
Yep, consciousness stuff.
Consciousness aligning. But
so there are these channels that kind of we're on, and you could even look at like developmental channels, of course. But to be able to change the channel of consciousness by taking mushrooms or ayahuasca or cannabis, I think it's really an interesting way and useful for me to think about it. And what is on that channel, or what is the experience of changing that channel like? Because as you take an inventory of that in your experiences or in your studies, and in our work, we do a lot of psychedelic studies and prepare a lot of people for experiences with different substances. Like right now we're doing studies on LSD, 5-MeO-DMT, psilocybin, and other synthetic psychedelics in clinic. And they all have a different channel, if you will, or experience, somewhat.
Yeah, somewhat, right? There's an interesting overlap too. But working with psychedelics in this way over the last several years has tempted me to become sort of a materialist, reductionist, physicalist from like a philosophical perspective. Because what are we doing? We're changing the hardware, the way the hardware functions. I mean, this is one way to think about it, right?
Or running new software on your hardware,
yeah.
perhaps. Yeah.
But what changes the software? It's taking in some kind of chemical.
Yeah.
That binds to a receptor site in your brain.
There's a physical,
and as a result of that
molecular thing going on.
Yeah, as a result of that physical change, the channels that a person is perceiving or privy to changes. So again, we could get super bogged down in the philosophy of it, but it just has me wondering again what consciousness is. If your experience of consciousness can change by changing the physical makeup of, the wetware beneath your ears. So,
how about a brief intermission for a quote that might be thought-provoking in this regard? It's more, we've been talking about some of the scientific and philosophical and some semantic considerations of consciousness. This one gets more into the kind of spiritual realms, but which I think, is worth exploring a bit as well. But it's by Tom Campbell. It says, "We are here to lower the entropy of our consciousness," which in simple terms means to grow and become love. It's about caring, compassion, and positive interactions, sharing, cooperating, and being helpful. We typically start life self-centered. Think about babies, focused on survival as children, but as we mature, we were meant to grow out of that and learn to consider others, be kind, and improve the quality of our consciousness.
I would ask this person, why is love less entropic than any other form of consciousness? Is it because it's an organizing principle? If entropy is not necessarily chaos. Entropy is moving toward disintegration.
Yeah, it's a good question. So
I feel like I'm in philosophy 101 now and asking the professor annoying questions.
And I definitely don't feel like the professor here. I'm like, okay, Steve, let's open this next portal, right. And see what's there. But
walking on this shared road. Yeah.
But there's the free energy principle that kind of Robin Carhart Harris and others built the Rebus hypothesis on about psychedelics, relaxed beliefs under psychedelics that, I think we'll talk more about, but that the brain, it's about uncertainty reduction. This isn't, I know I'm not even getting anywhere near the question of why would love be considered a lower entropy state?
Sure. More of a hypothetical question.
But, if biological systems do resist a natural tendency to disorder, destruction, and extinction.
Yeah.
And
oblivion.
So love, we could try to carve out some debates of love being entropy reducing in that regard if we wanted, but I don't think it's very high yield.
Yeah. And you started by sort of talking about the sort of the spiritual side. And I know that there are people who would probably make the argument that love is sort of a fundamental substrate of who we are. And so if it is, then it would be inherently less entropic. It's organizing, it's basic, it's archetypal. So I guess, that would make sense. And it is often the case that when people alter their minds with many of the psychedelics that we work with in the lab and in clinic, that they often have that shared experience that all we are is love, or this sort of common humanity, or a union with God or the universe or the Mother Earth or a tree or something like that. And there's often this affection and acceptance, unconditional love that they experience as part of the mystical experience.
Yeah. And I love that part of the equation. I really feel like I'm drawn equal parts to the scientific considerations of consciousness and the mystery of it. And that part of our work in clinic, a research clinic that gets to explore the mystical experience, gets to help people occasion it, is pretty amazing. Yeah. But I think it's also what draws me to yoga, but with maybe it helps tone down my scientific mind. here's another quote for you from a yoga master in India, just to give you a flavor of how they view consciousness and say a practice on a path to enlightenment. This is by, it's in the Advaita Vedanta, one of the Vedic texts. It says, the sublimely blissful experience of the boundless pure consciousness, and represents the unity of spiritual essence of ultimate reality, is Satchitananda, truth, consciousness, bliss. So, yeah, it's the consciousness being just one component of that kind of equation or description of like your like limitless consciousness existence. And to experience more of that is to realize more of your spiritual journey, or where we're going to experience like more truth, consciousness, bliss, or more pure, unbounded awareness.
Truth, consciousness, bliss. Is there a bias toward desirable experiences there? Because wouldn't a part of consciousness also be things that would be the opposite of bliss?
So bliss, another way of describing it would be a joy that changes and dances in many ways, a divine joy that remains when there are difficult experiences, more of a contentment than a happiness, perhaps. But
so an orientation to whatever is. And what is could be really challenging and even terrible, but there's a contentment or a non-attachment, maybe.
Yeah. So these three components, Ananda being the bliss or divine love, some might call it, even though it might be harder to latch onto that with your brains, but this state of contentment, samadhi, that occurs when one becomes more liberated from the attachments and aversions and things that, like the constraints on our consciousness. And then, so there's Sat is the truth. So you're cutting through the illusion that you're separate, that duality, and more into the unity consciousness. And then the Chit is like the consciousness component is kind of the true nature of yourself, or the waking up, or the innate intelligence. Like that's another way I've heard people describe it, or even in like LDS religion, intelligence is a way sometimes people will describe this
eternal nature of humans.
Which I think in what resonates with me, like whether it's from a yoga perspective, a spiritual debate perspective of like, where does this strange thing come from, or from these like yoga philosophy approaches, it does, or the intelligence idea does resonate and feel like it's more of a force than a thing, and more of I guess there's so much mystery it's hard to even put words on.
Speaking of the mystery, I watched this clip of a stand-up by Pete Holmes. And Pete Holmes is a really interesting comedian who's also very much a spiritualist, right? He's sort of a disciple of Ram Dass in a way, and wrote a really cool book called Comedy, Sex, God. And in this bit, he talks about God being, I think he said, the blanket that we throw over the mystery to give it shape. Yeah. And he might have been quoting somebody else, but I just thought that was a really interesting way of thinking about the mystery. And the ways we try to make sense, the ways we try to make sense of it. Yeah. And all the different sort of ideas and philosophies that we're discussing today and that we've discussed a lot on this podcast are ways to give shape to the mystery, but also maintaining perspective that it is all very mysterious. And it's hard to observe consciousness with consciousness.
Did you throw a blanket over yourself to become your physical self in another way, right?
Or is the physical body, this corporeal form, the blanket that we throw over this enduring force, this intelligence, to give it some kind of shape or form?
Yeah. So the mystery remains, but maybe we should talk a bit more about rebus as a common kind of mechanism of psychedelic transformation, or prevailing theory of one, right?
Yeah. Well, you sent me a paper by Saffron et al. Entitled "On the Varieties of Conscious Experience, Altered Beliefs Under Psychedelics." ABUS. So
rebus expands.
This paper is complex, very, very interesting. I'm not a neuroscientist, so some of the neuroscience was a bit lost on me, but it was trying to add some more color to the complex ideas put forth by Carhart Harris when he was trying to describe what it is that psychedelics do in the brain and to consciousness that we might attribute the benefits of psychedelics. And so, Carhart Harris came up, as you mentioned, with this idea of rebus, relaxed beliefs under psychedelics. So that psychedelics, increase the entropy in the mind. They relax your beliefs such that these, I think what he calls priors, right?
Yeah.
So that these rigid beliefs that you have that were filtering out all experience to maintain a particular religious belief are relaxed, so that they can be updated by here and now experience. And so you can imagine taking a high dose psychedelic and you've had a rigid belief about your unworthiness, and it gets relaxed. There's a lot of things that are happening neurologically that we might sort of attribute that relaxation to. And so now you can actually feel what it feels like to be lovable, instead of having it being proposed to you as a hypothesis that you reject by your mom, right? No, I love you. Okay, but I don't feel lovable. So that's sort of my quick and dirty explanation of relaxed beliefs under psychedelics.
Yeah, and I think that process of kind of freeing oneself of that constraint is an example of what we were talking about. Like, what is this Ananda bliss thing that some ancient philosophies use to describe some of this consciousness experience? But I think your description was great, because it's based on this idea that we're generating a mental model of the world as we go, and taking in input and layering it in this hierarchy that generates predictions about what's going to happen next based on the information we've collected, which, of course, isn't perfectly accurate, and it's just a sampling of the universe, and also can be affected by all these forces at play and experiences in our life. And then, so the comparison of what happens in life to what your prediction was generates this kind of experience of a prediction error, or this kind of neuroplastic event that can revise your model for next time and say, oh, next time I walk into the therapy room, maybe they're not going to instantly reject me and judge me because Steve was nice in that corrective experience just now.
Right.
Yeah.
So you use the term neuroplastic, and it's a term that gets thrown around a lot when people talk about psychedelics these days, right? Neuroplasticity. And, your random Instagram health guru shaman that talks about psychedelics will talk about the reason they are helpful is because they cause neuroplasticity. If you want to learn more about the complexities of neuroplasticity, you could listen to our interview with Gould Dolan.
Yeah, that was a fun chat.
Really, really interesting chat. But so, and you could say that what's happening, described by rebus, is attributable to neuroplasticity. So, you've got new connections being made between neurons. You've got new dendrites being formed. There's a lot of stuff going on in the brain. But one of the ideas posed by Saffron and others in this paper is that psychedelics do more than just relax beliefs. Sometimes they might actually strengthen beliefs.
Yeah.
So ALBUS, the altered beliefs under psychedelics, is sort of this umbrella term under which rebus remains. You're still going to get relaxed beliefs, but they introduce now another acronym, CBUS.
We needed new acronyms to use on this podcast.
If there's anything we need, it's more acronyms.
Thank you, authors.
So strengthened beliefs under psychedelics.
I just picture this flexing this ego muscle.
Yeah. So again, it's an incredibly dense and a little, not dense, but complex paper. But they talk about, it was interesting, one of the ways they'd sort of delineate between rebus and CBUS is that sometimes under the influence of a psychedelic, it isn't that you are relaxing certain beliefs, it's that certain beliefs are actually strengthened. And they talk about that maybe, and this sort of informs clinical practice, that it is the higher dose psychedelic experiences that might occasion more rebus type experiences, and maybe the micro or cyclitic dose psychedelic experiences could produce the more cebus.
And I think our clinical practice kind of informs that theory too, because we do tend to, in general, I'll agree that 5 dried grams of mushrooms in silent darkness is more likely to have some relaxed beliefs than a microdose in, I don't know, the library or something. So it's interesting because you get a psychedelic on board, your high-level priors, your pre-existing beliefs about self and reality are relaxed, allowing for greater openness to new interpretations, more cognitive flexibility, which is a good thing to have, right? And then the paper talks about the mechanism of this. It's not all the default mode network, but there's this increased global connectivity. And then there's greater neuronal entropy. And part of why I wanted to avoid too much of an entropy exploration is because it gets confusing in there. Because this greater neural entropy does lead to more flexible and less predictive thought patterns. But I think what strikes me of hearing you kind of talk about the paper is that this can be, this is a tool, can be used for positive change, or perhaps less positive or more maladaptive change, or strengthening beliefs that you might have already been primed to adopt that might not be serving you well.
Yeah. Yeah, and in fact, this paper is an example of what I think we need more of in the psychedelic science, especially clinical science space.
Yeah.
And that is more precision and nuance. And I pulled a quote from the paper that speaks to this, where they say, regardless of whether or not the Albus framework is accepted as a unifying model, we hope to show why it is necessary for us to take caution in ever making blanket statements about psychedelics. That is, rather than saying psychedelics do X, we would do better to say this psychedelic at this range of doses tends to do X, Y, and Z in A, B, and C contexts. Like,
I like that.
It speaks to, we can't just say, as they're saying, well, psychedelics cause neuroplasticity and that's why they're good for your mental health. Because that's a blanket statement that is not necessarily true.
It is the time to, in the kind of progression of this psychedelic renaissance and whatever chapter we're in, to be like, just much more upfront about the forces at play, the positives and the negatives, the risks, and not just the benefits, because the paper points out that, like, in stressful or negative settings, under these models, psychedelics could reinforce paranoia or delusions, right?
Yeah, the strengthening beliefs under psychedelics, the CBIS.
Yeah. And then there's also the suggestibility implications that, is already talked about in a lot of our, like, psychedelic trainings and studies and everything else. But because you can come out with these deep convictions and can amplify, spiritual, mystical things, it can also, there's a risk of suggestibility and adopting false or harmful beliefs when exposed to, say, misleading influences, or it highlights the importance of very careful guidance, ethical guidance.
Yeah, in the paper, they are sort of trying to give some more context and precision to phrases we've used in the psychedelic space for a long time to describe what a psychedelic does. Like, a psychedelic is a non-specific amplifier, or a psychedelic is, like the name implies, mind manifesting. What is it amplifying? Is it really non-specific? What aspects of the mind is it manifesting? You talked about suggestibility. I was, before we hit record, I confessed that there are 2 words in this paper that I'd never heard before that describe a phenomenon that often happen with psychedelic experiences. One is pareidolia, the tendency to see meaningful pattern or image in a random or ambiguous visual stimulus.
You can't know all those words, Steve. There are so many more of them.
I'm on my way to learn all the words. But this is like seeing a face in a cloud. Right. Or if you're on a psychedelic, it's, seeing the face of Lucifer in, the paint.
I love finding the words when you've already had the experience and you're like,
of course. Of course, there's some fancy Latin word that describes that.
Yeah, you could make one up too if you.
These
if
do
you
sound
felt
like
it.
They do sound like made up Harry Potter spells. But the other is
Yes.
apophenia, the tendency to see patterns and connections between things that aren't actually related.
Oh,
Yeah.
So maybe there's a risk for conspiratorial thinking there, perhaps. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, and the folks that study and communicate about so-called conspirituality will often talk about the seemingly reliable pipeline between people who really immerse themselves in ecstatic experience and being really susceptible to conspiratorial thinking.
Yeah, yeah, and it's tricky. It's sad that that there is that risk of, I don't know, negative influence in these settings that are often presented to be sacred. But yeah, and it is. I think it's important to talk about. I'm glad we're ending up here in our discussion.
Yeah. Yeah. So we meandered into the psychedelic sort of realm when talking about consciousness. I'm just wondering if there's anything else substantive to say.
I've got one more quote for you on this guiding idea in consciousness. This is by Rowan and Jacobs from a book called The Therapist's Use of Self. So it's talking about therapy in general, but I think it applies well to psychedelic sitting that special set and setting. When we empathetically attune to another, we gently tune into, sense, and resonate with their experience. Think of two violins in a room. It could be amazing to see how when the strings on one are plucked, the other vibrates too when it's tuned to the same frequency. Cellos.
Yeah. Yeah. Played cello in high school. And I've often thought about consciousness as sort of a string instrument that it sometimes falls out of tune, and you can tell, right? It's dissonant, and that you can sort of retune consciousness to what is, harmonious to your values, et cetera. But yeah, I think if there is putting the sort of unsolvable problem of what is consciousness maybe to the side, if there is some promise in using psychedelics to alter your consciousness, it is that by changing these channels, you get a different perspective on what problems, psychological or otherwise, have been causing you to suffer. And so, not that it's a panacea, like I think we've sort of beat that point to death, but
not that it's the only way to get that different perspective. But when used in the right way, it can be an amazing tool.
Yeah.
Yeah. Cool. Should we call it there?
Let's call it there.
Okay. Thanks, Steve, for meandering with me.
Always fun. Psychedelic Therapy Frontiers is brought to you by Numinous Network, a company committed to helping people heal and be well by delivering technology-driven clinic support, clinical trial research, and comprehensive practitioner training in psychedelic-assisted therapy. You can learn more about Numinous Network at numinous.com. That's numinus.com. If you enjoyed the show today and you want to support us, here's how you do it. You can leave a rating or review on places like Apple Podcasts and Spotify, subscribe to the Numinous YouTube channel, like the YouTube videos, and share the show with somebody you think might enjoy it. If you're interested in comprehensive training in psychedelic-assisted therapy, check out our courses at numinous.com/training. These courses are carefully crafted by Numinous professionals like myself, Reid, and others, and include live online classes, experiential learning, and opportunities to connect with a diverse community of practitioners in the psychedelic medicine space. I really love teaching these courses and connecting with you all, so check out numinous.com/training, and I hope to see you at the next training cohort. The content of this podcast does not constitute medical advice or mental health treatment. Please consult with a medical or mental health professional if you believe you are in need of mental health treatment.